Hey guys, Peter here to do an album review. Today I'm here to tell you about the latest from Jinjer, Wallflowers, out August 27th on Napalm Records. This album has 11 tracks, 47 minutes in length, and this is the band's 4th full-length studio album. They are an Ukrainian prog groove metal band. Now this album feels very different from the get-go. It feels different from the soundscape approach, but it also feels different in the way it is constructed. I really feel like one impacts the other. Previous records always gave me a sense of continuity, a sense of fluidity, understanding exactly where my starting point was, how the road ahead was going to look like, and where the finish line exists. This album feels a little bit chaotic from that sense because it pulls you in different directions. You don't know if you're going forward, if you're going backwards. It's an album that doesn't necessarily have a starting point, and it definitely doesn't end. It just has this sense of continuing into this vacuum. So it almost like it exists within itself without necessarily having a sense of direction built in within the structure of the record in terms of how it's presented. To me, you could make things a little bit more defined, or you could have more of a path just by changing perhaps 2 tracks. I really feel like Wallflower is a song that could come in the middle of the record, almost to define a break within the album, and then closing off the record, I would have liked to see As I Boil Ice, a song that has a little bit of a sense of finality in terms of how it sounds, in terms of how it is constructed. So changing these 2 songs in terms of where they are and the overall track listing of the album definitely would help define the barriers of the record, would definitely define the path that the album can take, and definitely give it more of a sense of continuity. In the way that it is, it just feels a little bit volatile, and that was a little bit harder for me to connect with the record. It was a little bit harder for me to understand exactly where I am within the space of time that defines the existence of this album. Once you get into the soundscape, this is a record that has heaviness to it, but I don't really think it could be defined by that alone. There's other things that are pushing that heaviness to the forefront. There's other elements that are really bringing a sense of composure to the way the soundscape of this record comes across. You really have to look at the guitars, the bass, the drums, and the vocals, how they're all working together in order to create volume, in order to make this album feel more robust. This is to me more of a groovy record than it is a heavy record. Obviously there's heaviness that comes out of that grooviness, but overall the sound that's boiling underneath it, the existence of all of these elements coming together, how it sounds, very chunky. This is a very chunky guitar driven album, perhaps more than previous. So all of these elements coming together really make the album feel bigger, and because it feels bigger, it feels heavier. But I don't necessarily feel like this is a consistently heavy album top to bottom. You still get that grooviness all over the place. It's a very chunky driven groovy record from a guitar's perspective, but overall from all the elements in terms of how they cooperate one with another, you're still gonna get that prog element that it's always there on a Jinjer record coming through, sometimes more in some songs, sometimes less in others, but it's definitely there's the DNA of the band. I just felt like they brought to the forefront elements that perhaps were there in previous records, but were there more as a layer underneath the surface and not necessarily getting a chance to be in the forefront or to be on the spotlight. On this record, they changed things around. They brought into the forefront elements that were hidden, and they hid some elements that were normally more in the forefront. So that to me is really the definition of the soundscape on this record. The guitars on this album sound phenomenal. It really feels like there's multiple guitar players because of the sound that it has. They just feel alive. They just really feel thick. Like I said before, very chunky, very groovy, and this is something that stays very consistent throughout the whole record, even when there's some more prog elements coming into the forefront and defining better the sound, or making the sound a little bit more driven, a little bit more eclectic. I always felt like they always went back to that grooviness, they always went back to that chunkiness, and made the guitars feel just so powerful, sometimes almost overwhelming as far as the overall experience of this record. The drums and bass fill in the gaps. They add heaviness when they need to, they add grooviness when they need to, but I really felt that they were working super well together, almost as one single piece and not necessarily as 2 separated elements, in order to fill in the gaps where the guitars couldn't be. Whatever the guitars couldn't reach, the drums and bass were there to fill in those gaps and to make the sound as robust as possible. As far as vocals goes, Tati is phenomenal on this record. I feel like she's getting better with every single album. I love her harsh vocals, but her clean vocals really bring that jazz element to the forefront. I felt that from the first time I heard her. I think it's more of a factor now. It's becoming more of an element that really defines the experience of the vocals all around. She brings a lot of melancholy into this record. There's melancholy in the sound of the album, but I think she really emphasizes that melancholy with her voice, with her clean vocals, with her tone, and how she delivers the lyrics on this album. Overall, this is a very interesting album from Jinjer. I think this is a step as far as the evolution of the band is concerned. Definitely different from Macro. Like I said before, I think they brought into the forefront elements that were already there in the past, but perhaps not having the same spotlight as they're going to get on this album, and moving into the backdrop some that had a little bit more of a role in previous records. So it's an interesting aspect. It's still Jinjer. It's just a different side, a different face of what we've seen up until this point, and showing us that they can always grow, they can always morph, and they can always create something interesting without really disconnecting from their original DNA. As far as favorite songs are concerned, I picked 3 tracks that are very different, that offer different elements, starting off with Colossus. The name says it all. This is a Colossus sounding track. It's so big, both vocally and musically. Great guitar sound, super chunky, super driven, really pushing the song forward. Very dynamic track musically and vocally, ups and downs, ebbs and flows, always morphing, always moving, but there's a sense of consistent heaviness from the beginning all the way to the end that adds to the overall thunderous approach that this track has. In a track that's named Colossus, you have to follow it through by creating a Colossus sounding track, and that's exactly what they did here. The vocals really help push that element of volume and power into the forefront. Next, you have Disclosure, my favorite track on the album. Really groovy, really grungy. It brings a lot of different elements to the table, shows perhaps a different side of Jinjer without, like I said previously, disconnecting completely from the past. But the grooviness of this song is really what sets it apart from other tracks. The grungy elements that this song has, the infusion of grunge in this song, sets it apart from previous and tracks that coming forward, making this a very unique track from a sound perspective, but also from a vocal approach. I love the vocal layers. It just adds so much existence to the song. It adds a heartbeat. It adds a little bit of a flow to it. Magnificent track all around. Last but not least, Wallflower. This is the melancholic ballad of the record. As melancholic and as much as a ballad as you're going to get out of Jinjer. It has a lot of classic heavy metal elements as far as the structure is concerned, specifically when you look at a ballad, starting off a little bit more stripped out, a little bit more melancholic, having a sense of growth both musically and vocally, always approaching that climax, always approaching that aggression, that point where everything comes out, and that's exactly how they designed this track. It doesn't sound like classic heavy metal, but it does have a classic heavy metal ballad structure to it. And then you add the Jinjer DNA, you bring in that melancholy, you bring in that ballad style approach. Phenomenal track that really feels like it's growing, like it's moving as you progress through it. This is it. This is Jinjer with Wallflowers, out August 27th on Napalm Records. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the album, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.